Hi everyone. So a couple months ago, maybe more like a year ago, I made a video on atheism and religious practice. I will link that in the description if you didn't see that one. But in that video, at the very end, I suggested what might be a possible connection between atheism and faith. And what I want to do in this talk today is basically kind of expand on that suggestion and explore the question of like the extent to which an atheist could or could not have faith. Um, so I have sort of aimed this at a broad audience. So if you already have like a lot of background in like philosophy and epistemology and belief, you might want to kind of skip this beginning part, but I do want to kind of have a lot of background in this video about sort of the nature of belief and the definition of atheism and that kind of thing. Okay, so like I said, we're talking about this question, can atheists have faith? But to really kind of give a full background and understanding of that question, I want to begin with just a really basic question, which is, what is belief? Okay, the first thing to note about belief is that we believe statements. These are sort of true or false, often expressed by declarative sentences. Philosophers call these propositions. And when it comes to a statement or a proposition that you've considered, most philosophers think basically there's three belief-like attitudes that you can take towards it. You can believe it. That's basically regarding it as true. So I believe 1 + 1 = 2. Let's say there's a high chance of snow tomorrow, then maybe I believe that it'll snow tomorrow. I am in Toronto in the winter, right? Second, there's withholding. So withholding belief is really being undecided about whether a statement or proposition is true. So, I withhold belief that a fair coin will land heads. I withhold belief that there's an even number of stars. You don't necessarily actually also only withhold belief on things that are exactly 50-50, and I'll give some more examples of that in a second. But just to continue on, we then can also disbelieve statements. So that's when you regard a proposition to be false. So, I disbelieve that Notre Dame will go undefeated in football next year. I am an avid fan, but not enough to be disillusioned about this. They're probably going to lose at least one game, right? I also disbelieve 1 + 1 = 3. So one way I like to kind of think about these three belief attitudes, and I often show my students, is that it's kind of like voting. This is actually an analogy from Richard Feldman, but I think it's pretty helpful. So he says, let's suppose there's a vote on whether money should be given to restore a state park. When it comes to voting, you can really do three things. You can vote yes, similar to believing. You're saying, yes, it's true, or voting, yes, that should happen. You can vote no, kind of similar to disbelieving, no, it shouldn't happen. Or when you disbelieve, you say that thing is false. Or you can not vote at all. So let's say you're allowed to abstain from voting. That's kind of similar to withholding belief. So in the same way that in cases of yes, no voting, it seems like we really have these three options, belief is similar to voting. That said, notice that we hold these belief attitudes with varying levels of confidence. So thinking about some of our examples, I'm 100% confident or pretty dang close to 100% confident that 1 + 1 = 2. Depends on some issues and skepticism we won't get into here. But let's say the forecast predicts like a 90% chance of snow tomorrow, then I'm more like 90% confident it will snow tomorrow. Even though I believe both those things, I believe 1 + 1 = 2 and that it'll snow tomorrow. So both believing, different levels of confidence. I'm more like 50% confident that a fair coin will land heads. I also, like I said, withhold belief on things that aren't exactly 50-50. So maybe whether someone watching this video has a birthday today or whether a three-sided die will land a 3. Those aren't exactly like a 50-50 thing, but I withhold belief on those. I have very little confidence that Notre Dame will go undefeated in football next year, although I wouldn't assign it a probability 0. So greater than 0% chance, still disbelieve it, right? But when it comes to something like 1 + 1 = 3, I'm going to be 0% on that. In other words, I think the probability of that is 0, or you could reverse it and say I'm 100% confident that 1 + 1 = 3 is false. And again, when we're kind of thinking about voting, this kind of, the analogy still sort of works here. because you could vote yes confidently or enthusiastically. You could also vote yes reluctantly. So it's like, yeah, I do think the money should be given. I feel like there's this better option, but that's like not going to happen. So I'm going to vote yes, but reluctantly. In the same way, you can believe something with high confidence, voting enthusiastically, or with lower confidence, voting reluctantly. Okay, so this is kind of like the background in mind. We have belief, withholding, disbelief, attitudes we take towards a statement, and then we can take those attitudes with varying levels of confidence. I want to now look at a second kind of background question that I think is pretty important, which is the question, what is an atheist? So remember, we believe propositions, we believe true or false statements. When it comes to defining atheism and also related terms like theism and agnosticism, the proposition in question is going to be at least one God exists, or something like God or gods exist. So if you believe that at least one God exists, you're a theist. If you withhold belief that at least one God exists, you're an agnostic. And if you disbelieve that at least one God exists, you're an atheist. So some people say, oh no, atheism is lack of belief or whatever. There's a lot of good reasons to question that. I'll link a nice video from Joe Schmid in the description here, but I'll just say this here. Almost no philosophers define atheism that way. I think there's a lot, I think it makes atheism a lot less of an interesting view to define it that way. But also, we just kind of have this tripartite view of belief that pretty much everyone in epistemology accepts. And theism and atheism and agnosticism fit into it in a very intuitive way. So I'm not really going to be thinking or talking about lack of belief atheism. If you want to take atheism out and put a different word in, that's fine. I don't really also here want to argue about semantics, but here I am concerned with people that disbelieve that God or gods exists, or in other words, they believe no gods exist. Okay, so here's an important thing to note about these people that believe that no gods exists. They are not necessarily 100% confident that God doesn't exist. Some of them might be. I don't want to make a psychological claim that some of that no atheists are 100% certain that God doesn't exist. But this isn't a necessary part of being an atheist. So remember the Notre Dame example, right? I disbelieve that Notre Dame is going to win all of their games next year, but I'm not certain of that, right? I'm not going to say that has a 0% probability. I'm not certain that it's false, right? And so in the same way, we can disbelieve something, like disbelieve that God exists, without being 100% sure that thing is false. So I think, yeah, you could be an atheist and be like moderately confident that God exists. Maybe you're like 80% sure. Or you might be even more sure than that, like 90 to 90% sure that no gods exists. But I also I think like, look, atheism doesn't mean we have to be 100% sure that God does not exist. And also same applies to theism. I've talked about this in a lot of my videos. Theists don't have to be 100% sure that God exists. And in fact, I think in some ways that's overrated. So I'm not going to necessarily get into this here, but I just think we really get into like being super confident, and we think that's the most important thing. And I just think that's not the most important thing. And also there's really interesting arguments that neither theists nor atheists actually should be that confident in their views. Again, don't necessarily want to go there here. The point is that you don't have to be 100% sure that God doesn't exist or assign theism a probability of 0 to be an atheist. It's going to be important for my later argument. Okay, before I jump into section 2, just want to address 2 quick things. The first is the question of what is God, or what are gods? Hard to define. People disagree about the definition of God or the conception of God. A popular definition in philosophy that kind of goes back to Anselm is like the 4 O's definition. So God's omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, omnipresent, exists everywhere, and omnibenevolent, all good. But that is a specific controversial definition. It's also monotheistic. And actually, some philosophers have even argued that this is not the God that is described in the Bible, the Torah, or the Quran. That said, I am interested in faith here, and I will say that much of the literature on faith does concern the major monotheisms, and that is sort of the literature I'm most familiar with. So I don't necessarily want to put what I'm saying in a box here, but I do think it's good to be upfront about the viewpoint that you're coming from. But I don't think you have to be monotheistic or be coming from one of these traditions to accept the view of faith that I'm going to paint here. So the way I'm generally thinking about God or gods is a powerful, transcendent, good being. Rough definition. I know, especially the idea that God is good is going to be controversial. I'm open to maybe weakening that, perhaps. And I didn't say omnibenevolent, but I do think that God is, so that means all good, but I do think the conception of God I'm thinking about does paint God as good in some sense. So I don't know that what I'm saying would like apply to an evil God, but tell me in the comments if maybe it can. So the general story is I'm coming from a monotheistic tradition, but I'm hoping that what I kind of say here can apply to many different conceptions of God. Okay, the final thing I want to say, some people in the faith literature make this big fuss between faith that a proposition is true and faith in. I'm not really going to make a big fuss about that distinction here. I don't think it really matters much for our purposes. And also, you can do a lot of translating back and forth, right? I have faith in God versus I have faith that God exists. I have faith in my spouse versus I have faith that my spouse is a good person or my spouse would never do XYZ or whatever. So, you know, I'm just going to kind of slide in between those two, and I don't think much should hang on that. Okay, let's move to section 2, clarifying the question. Okay, so this was actually partially in response to my last video, something I wanted to say. To recap what we've talked about so far, though, very briefly, we've talked about belief-like attitudes, the 3 belief-like attitudes, and how you can hold those attitudes to different levels of confidence. Then we also talked about what atheism is, how atheists aren't necessarily certain that there's no God, and then a little bit about the definition of God. So now I really want to turn to kind of our main question. And again, some people gave me some feedback from the last video about this, so I wanted to sort of address this here. Okay, so obviously the way I kind of frame this question is, can atheists have faith? I actually don't think ultimately that's our question, though. I was trying to keep things a little simple, but I think this isn't our question because the answer is obvious. Of course they can. There's lots of instances of non-religious faith. So what I think faith is, and I think this is a view that's pretty widely held by a lot of philosophers, it's something that kind of underlies our commitments in general. So it's not just a religious thing. Faith is something we can have in our family and friends. So you probably have faith in your spouse or faith in your marriage. You might have faith in a friendship, faith that your friend will win their upcoming basketball game. Oh, sorry about that. You might also have faith in ideals or faith in, you know, yeah, things that ways you want the world to become. So faith in recycling, faith in democracy, faith that world peace is achievable. But also hopefully have to some extent faith in yourself, right? Faith that you'll finish a degree or meet your goals, or faith that you'll come out healthy on the end of a serious surgery. So of course atheists can have faith, especially when it comes to all these instances of non-religious faith. Okay, so that's not our question. Too easy. Question try 2. Well, maybe you think, can atheists have religious faith? Would be the question. And again, I think this answer is actually obviously yes, because of non-theistic religions. So versions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism. I don't want to make a claim about all of these, every version of all of these religions, but I think in at least some interpretations or denominations within these, God or God's existing is just not a core doctrine. It's not a core teaching. They don't really center the religion around belief in or worship of God or gods. They might still think like belief in certain things is important, but it's just not theistic beliefs. So it's pretty clear and obvious that an atheist could have faith and even religious faith in non-theistic religions. I will say one question that kind of comes up here is the question of how do you define religion? And I'm not going to get into that here. Some people have suggested things like it's the belief in a transcendental reality, but I know a lot of definitions of religion end up like excluding non-traditional religions and including things like Marxism. And so, yeah, complicated, hard question. I think there's a whole SEP entry on it. You should check that out if you're interested. But I do think really here all I need is that these traditions that are non-theistic count as religions, and I think that's obviously the case. So yes, atheists can have religious faith. So try 3. Can atheists have theistic faith? And as you see on the handout, this is the question I'm interested in. Theistic faith is faith that theism is true. By theism, we mean the existence of at least one God, or relatedly, faith in a religion where theism is one of the core doctrines. So you can see it as faith in God or gods, faith that God or gods exists. Okay, here I think the answer is harder. And I think in fact, some might say no right away. Like, how could an atheist have faith at all? Faith that God exists? They believe God doesn't exist. Like, I think philosophers have said maybe not so fast here. One reason is that faith and belief are not actually the same thing. So I believe that there was a global pandemic, but I don't have faith that there was a global pandemic. I believe that, maybe I missed my flight a couple weeks ago and then I had to wake my 1-year-old up at 3 in the morning to catch a 6 a.m. flight, but I don't have faith that those things are true. And that's partially because a lot of philosophers think that faith requires a desire or a pro attitude or viewing the object of faith as good, and belief just doesn't. So having faith that God exists, it's not the same thing as believing God exists. That's one way these come apart. And kind of putting this on the flip side, a lot of philosophers have also thought you could have faith. So that's a case of belief without faith, because you believe something, but you think it's bad, so you don't have faith. A lot of philosophers have thought you can have the reverse too. You can have faith without belief. And more specifically, they've argued that agnostics who withhold belief on whether God exists can have religious faith. So there's a lot of people that argue this. One big proponent, Bill Alston, Robert Audi, but Dan Howard-Snyder is one who I'm going to interact with in this paper. So Howard-Snyder, his view is something like this, and I am sympathetic to this as well. Part of the role of faith is that it helps us keep our commitments in light of doubts and in light of counter evidence. But when it comes to doubts and counter evidence, those can be strong enough that one loses belief. Howard-Snyder gives an extended example involving Mother Teresa here. Mother Teresa went through what's called a dark night of the soul, and a lot of people think kind of lost belief in God, at least at certain points, but like continued in this really genuine, really wholehearted commitment to God through really the course of her entire life. And so that's a nice case study, but the general idea is that even if you lose belief, you can still have a decent amount of confidence in the object of faith. You can think the object of faith is probable or more likely than not. And these attitudes are weaker than belief, but they still count as having this positive belief-like attitude. So the key thing here is that to be an agnostic doesn't mean you treat the object of faith as false. It means that you don't believe it, you don't disbelieve it, you're kind of undecided, but you can still think it's likely. And so I think that's important and kind of one of the driving reasons behind a lot of these philosophers thinking agnostics can't have faith. There's another philosopher named Imran Ajaz. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong, but he also has a paper called The Skeptical Muslim, where he argues a similar thing in kind of an Islamic context. So he looks at the word iman, which is faith in the Quran, and he argues that that is compatible with doubt and doesn't require belief. So yeah, there's different people coming from different traditions sort of making the same argument. Okay, but this still doesn't answer our question about whether atheists can have theistic faith. So there's really, my sense is the literature on this question has been pretty divided on 2 different extremes. So Dan Howard-Snyder, Ijaz, other philosophers have really kind of said unequivocally, no, atheists cannot have theistic faith. So Howard-Snyder, again, he says faith requires a positive belief-like attitude, even if it's not belief. And he thinks this is going to preclude disbelief, so atheists cannot have theistic faith. When you're an atheist, you're basically taking a stance against the truth of theism. You're saying theism is false. There is no God, right? And so he says that's just not compatible with having faith that God exists. Atheists are going to have this tendency, this strong tendency to deny that God exists. Those people can't have faith. So ultimately, I'm actually not going to fully agree with this, but I do think there's something right about it and something intuitive about it, right? It does seem odd to think that someone who disbelieves that God exists, representing the world such that there's no God, could at the same time have faith that God exists or faith in God. Okay, so that's kind of the one extreme where people say, nope, atheists cannot have faith. Then there's this really whole other extreme. There's a Whitaker paper called Faith and Disbelief, and then Sam Lebens is also published a recent paper actually from a Jewish tradition. And both those papers are interesting, but I want to focus on the Whitaker paper because I think it has a really interesting kind of case study in it that I think is going to be instructive for our purposes. So basically, Whitaker thinks, look, you can continue to have faith if you act on something and you act as if it's true and you continue in your commitment in terms of action, even if you actively disbelieve the thing you're acting on. Okay. So here's this extended example. It's about someone named Sarah. She's a Christian. And for much of her early life, she believed the claims of Christianity. And then she went to grad school, and sort of throughout the course of grad school in a slow process, she eventually loses those beliefs and then really comes all the way around to finding herself disbelieving the claims of Christianity and disbelieving that God exists. So he says, here's a couple quotes, she no longer found the notions of Trinity or incarnation coherent. She saw no reason to attribute anything in nature to God's involvement. She found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the picture of God that she once had with the amount of human and animal suffering she saw around her. Although, so yeah, like she's an atheist, right? But she had no desire whatsoever to leave the Christian community. In fact, the thought of leaving startled her. She found herself desiring to recommit to involvement in her church. She volunteered for childcare on Sundays. She became involved in a program to help the homeless and continued giving to the church financially. She even resumed reading the New Testament. She found it always so deep, meaningful, and encouraging. And to this day, she's often moved to tears by the Bible's tales of forgiveness and grace. She's known to express her love for the character of Jesus to her close friends. And while she no longer believes in Jesus's imminent return to earth, she thinks it would just be wonderful if that were true. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah continues to believe that the moral outlook that she has learned from the New Testament and her church tradition is extremely valuable. It seems to her that if more people could embody the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, which she does still struggle to understand, the world would be vastly improved. So, despite her disbelief, Sarah's life is inextricably bound to the Christian tradition. So, interesting case, right? Someone disbelieves that God exists, they disbelieve the claims of Christianity, but their life is bound up with Christianity in this really, really deep, inseparable way. So Whitaker thinks, look, someone like Sarah who disbelieves that God exists, nonetheless has faith that God exists. Okay. So, and Lebens is making, again, a similar kind of move from the Jewish tradition and focusing on Jewish scriptures and stuff. I think, so we have, Howard-Snyder and Ajiz on the one hand, we have Whitaker and Lebens on the other hand. I actually think there's something both of these authors get right. And I think we can actually capture the plausible features of both of these views by making a distinction and then endorsing a middle ground position. Okay, so here's my position. Atheists can have action-focused faith, but they cannot have attitude-focused faith. And more specifically, theistic faith is what we're talking about. So they can have action-focused theistic faith, but not attitude-focused theistic faith. Okay, so let's get more into that and that distinction now. First, I want to just give us a general gloss of what faith is. Faith is basically a trusting commitment to someone or something. And again, we can have religious faith, we can have non-religious faith. We can have theistic faith, and here we are thinking about theistic faith, faith that at least one God exists. In general, this is going to be closely connected to trust. So I think faith and trust, I mean, I don't necessarily say they're the exact same thing, but very closely connected. And faith also involves a commitment. This commitment can be an attitude, like a belief. It can be an action-oriented commitment, etc. Okay. So that said, I think that's sort of a general definition of faith, but I still think even with that general definition, there's different kinds of faith. And I think one of the most important distinctions is between attitude-focused faith and action-focused faith. And I talk about this distinction and actually this general definition of faith in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry that I wrote on faith. So I can link that if you want more here, but I'm just going to give a basic class. So attitude-focused faith is faith as an attitude or as a mental state. It's basically faith as something in your head. So like things in your head would be like beliefs, desires, emotions, intentions. It's faith that's like in that category along those lines. And I think, kind of following Howard-Snyder here, it is going to involve at least two things. One is a positive, belief-like, or cognitive attitude towards the object of faith. When I say belief-like here, I don't mean that to always have to be a belief, but it's something that kind of represents the world, is responsive to evidence, and aims at truth. And this could be a belief, or it could be something like high confidence, thinking that things more likely than not, etc. And then it's also going to involve a positive desire-like attitude towards the object of faith. So like we talked about, people with faith tend to view the object of faith in a positive light. I don't have faith that my friend's had cancer. I don't have faith that there was a global pandemic, even though I believe those things. And that's because I don't view them positively. So faith requires this belief-like attitude and this desire-like attitude. Attitude-focused faith does. But that said, I think there's just a different way of having faith or a different kind of faith that's action-focused faith. This is faith as an action or as a decision, something that you do. So this is, I think when people say like leap of faith, I think they're often talking about this. So this is going to involve acting as if the propositions of faith are true, or what philosophers will call accepting. So if you accept a proposition, you act as if it's true. Remember, like, think about Sarah, who structures her life around the Christian story. That, I think, is a plausible example of how faith, action-focused faith, acting as if propositions are true. And I think some philosophers kind of debate about what faith is and like, is it a mental state? Is it an action? And I'm like, why not just say there are two kinds of faith? I think this is just a way more plausible picture. It doesn't mean these kinds of faith aren't connected or that in a lot of cases we don't see both of them together. But I think that in my view, it's much better to just make a distinction here than to go in this big debate about what is faith and what isn't faith. I will say too, I said attitude-focused faith involves these things, action-focused faith involves this. I'm not necessarily saying that's all it involves. Philosophers debate about what it involves. Like I said, I think faith involves trust, faith involves commitment. Some people think faith involves the emotions, ceasing to look for new evidence. There's going to be other things we need to probably add to get a full definition of these two kinds of faith. But I hope that seeing these main core features of each gives you enough to see the distinction. And I want to give actually two examples to also illustrate further how these can come apart. Okay, so the first would be a case where you have attitude faith, but you don't have action faith. So let's say one has attitude faith that their spouse isn't cheating on them. In this, they either believe their spouse isn't cheating or they're confident their spouse isn't cheating or, fill it in, but they have this belief-like attitude. And then they also desire for their marriage to succeed. They desire for their spouse not to cheat. They see their spouse as good, so they have the desire-like attitude. So they do have attitude-focused faith, but they're jealous, they're paranoid. They're constantly reading their spouse's texts and emails behind their back. They're worrying about their spouse's whereabouts. They're checking what their spouse says to see if they're trustworthy, like, asking their coworker, are they actually working late when they claim to be working late, etc. this person is probably irrational, and I'll agree with that, because they're really kind of acting on their jealousy, their paranoia, their fear, rather than what looks like justified beliefs and desires. But I think this is a possible example of someone with attitude faith without action faith. That said, I think in most cases, attitude faith will lead to action faith if the person is rational. But at least that can illustrate sort of the distinction and how those can come apart. Okay, second is an example of action faith without attitude faith. This is actually an example from Dan Speak in a paper I really like that's called Salvation Without Belief. He says, suppose Thomas was raised in circumstances that instilled a deep distrust of the police. Thomas finds himself in an unsafe situation, and a police officer is attempting to save him. Thomas needs to jump from a dangerous spot so the officer can catch him. While the officer has provided Thomas with evidence that he's reliable, Thomas can't shake the belief instilled from his upbringing that police are not trustworthy. Nonetheless, Thomas jumps. So intuitively, Thomas put his faith in the officer, but he did not believe that the officer is trustworthy. So Thomas, I think, like this explicitly said, Thomas believes the officer is not trustworthy. So Thomas does not have attitude-focused faith that the officer should be trusted, or attitude-focused faith in the officer, but he chooses to trust the officer anyway in virtue of his decision to make the jump. And so I think in that, Thomas has action-focused faith in the officer and does show some degree of trust in the officer, even if Thomas doesn't have maybe those beliefs that correspond to attitude-focused faith. Okay, so hopefully that is enough to kind of give a good understanding of that distinction. Now I want to really get into my exact thesis and kind of defend that specifically. So again, my thesis is that atheists can have action-focused theistic faith, but not attitude-focused theistic faith. So notice there's really two parts to that. They can have action-focused theistic faith. They cannot have attitude-focused theistic faith. So I'm going to really try to defend each of these parts. Okay, so part one, atheists can have action-focused theistic faith. What's going to be really crucial here is what we noted at the beginning, which is that atheists are not necessarily 100% confident that there's no gods. It's going to be really crucial. All of our examples are going to rely on that. And again, like we talked about, you can disbelieve something but not be certain it's false. You can disbelieve that God exists but not be certain that God does not exist. So here's 3 examples of atheists that have action-focused faith. The first is what I call the hopeful atheist. So the hopeful atheist says, look, I don't have enough evidence to believe that God exists. And in fact, I think the evidence actually supports that God does not exist. But I know that there's a chance I'm wrong. It is possible that God exists. And I hope that there's a powerful, good creator. On this basis, I'm going to commit to acting as if God exists. And what's crucial here is hope, because what hope requires is a desire or a positive attitude, and then just acknowledging that there's some possibility for the hoped for thing. So hope is actually not going to be enough to get us attitude-focused faith, but I've actually argued in other work, and I think it's plausible that in a lot of circumstances, you can act on hope. Hope can help you keep your commitments over time. And in some cases, hoping something is true is going to be sufficient grounds to act on it. And so this is really what the hopeful atheist is doing. They're saying, I hope God exists, even though I don't believe God exists, even though I actually disbelieve that God exists. And that hope sort of drives my commitment to God and drives my acting as if God exists. Okay. The second case is what I call the wagering atheist. So some of you might be familiar with the work I've done on Pascal's wager. So this person says, look, I'm an atheist. There's no God, but I also think there's some chance I'm wrong about that. And how good would it be if I committed to God and God did exist? Because knowing and being like God would be incredibly valuable. So on this basis, I'm going to commit to acting as if theism is true. So like I said, it sort of alludes to this argument known as Pascal's wager, where the atheist kind of does a cost-benefit analysis, and they say, look, because of how good it would be if I committed to God and God exists. It's rational for me to commit to God. And so they're sort of wagering on the possibility that God exists despite their atheism because they think there's some chance they're wrong with that. Okay, the final example is what I call the trying it on atheist. And this is an atheist who, again, believes God doesn't exist, but sees that religion has benefits. Maybe they see religious people around them that are happy and healthy, enjoy a good community. They have this assurance that God's taking care of them. Maybe they've even like read studies that sort of indicate there's a correlation between religion and well-being. I know that's empirically controversial, but there's some interesting empirical stuff there. And this person says, you know, of course, like, even though I'm an atheist, I could be wrong about religion, and I want to just give it a chance. I want to just try it on and see how it goes. And so I'm going to engage in these religious practices, commit to acting as if theism is true, and just kind of see what happens. Okay. So again, all of these atheists, part of their basis for having action-focused faith, for accepting that theism is true, is because they acknowledge it's possible that God exists. They're not 100% sure that God doesn't exist. I want to address what this might look like more practically speaking. And of course, this is going to kind of depend on the tradition, but here's some examples of what you might do if you accept that God exists. So you might pray. Steva Kleinschmidt has a very interesting paper called Atheistic Prayer, where she argues that even for an atheist, praying can be rational, talking to God. You might attend religious services or engage in religious rituals. So Benatar has a nice paper called Atheism and Religious Practice, where he kind of talks about, from a Jewish perspective, how it could be rational to sort of practice or engage in religion even as an atheist. You might participate in religious community. You might do the acts commanded by the religion. So fast, give to the poor. Recall Sarah, she was like tithing, giving money to her church, volunteering in Sunday school. You might read religious text. And in general, kind of like we talked about with the case with Sarah, you might structure your life around the religion, see the good and the beautiful in the religion. All of these things are possible for atheists to do, and perhaps could even be rational, although I haven't really argued that much. But I think they're at least possible to do as an atheist. And I think there's a good case to be made that they can be rational. And I think because an atheist can do all these things, this counts as action-focused theistic faith. Okay, so why not attitude-focused faith? Well, here, it's because of what attitude-focused faith requires. And again, we don't necessarily have to say that it requires a belief, but it does require a belief-like attitude towards theism, thinking it's likely, thinking it's more probable than not, thinking it's supported by evidence. And here, the problem is that atheists take theism to be false, right? So they're saying it is false that God exists. There is no God or gods. And so I think because of this, they're just not going to be candidates for these positive belief-like attitudes. And this has really, been suggested by a number of authors. Howard-Snyder is one, but Alston, Audi, Jazz, etc. The positive belief-like attitude, it doesn't just require saying, I'm not 100% sure that atheism is true. It requires a little bit more than that. And unfortunately, it's just going to clash with the fact that atheists take theism to be false. You could push me here and say, well, what if an atheist has a positive belief-like attitude towards theism and is an atheist? And in that case, I mean, that's interesting, but I think I would worry about rationality at minimum there. So maybe the best case scenario would be like you are an atheist, but you have like a high credence in theism. Interesting suggestion, but then at the very least, it's going to be hard for the atheist to be rational. They're going to be maybe double-minded in some way, or have something weird going on there. So maybe it's going to be hard to say it's just impossible, period, but it's impossible without something maybe irrational or weird or double-minded going on, like the person has contradictory beliefs or something like that. And that's just not the kind of thing that I think we're gonna yeah, it's not like a satisfying case, like, oh yeah, like you can have contradictory beliefs and so you can be an atheist and have theistic faith. Well, like then you're also a theist too, you know? And so then it's just, I just don't think it's a really interesting view. So not the kind of atheistic faith I think we would want to endorse. Okay. One thing that I think is really cool about my view, again, that atheists can have this action-focused faith, but not this attitude-focused faith, is that it can capture how people's beliefs can change over time, but they can still maintain this underlying theistic faith commitment. So in the Sarah case, Sarah moved from belief to disbelief. But throughout this process, Sarah kind of continues to act as if theism is true and accept theism, and in that sense, kind of continues in her faith commitment and maintains that faith commitment. You could also have the reverse too. So the wagering atheist arguably sort of starts off with disbelief, but then over a slow process of intentional action and acceptance, maybe they come to believe. I'm not saying that they have to or anything, but I think it's possible that you know, wagering or even the trying it on atheist could eventually come to be a theist. And so I think it's helpful because, you know, belief, withholding, disbelief, you can go through these attitudes, but still in some sense have that sort of action-focused commitment remain the same. And I think that's a positive of this view because it shows how commitment can undergo changes in belief, even big changes in belief. At the same time, it also captures the sense in which I think there is something that's important to theistic faith that's lost when one goes all the way to representing theism as false. And that's that they're going to lose attitude-focused theistic faith. I think this actually could apply to non-theistic cases as well. Like if you come to like believe your spouse is a bad person or something, something really could be lost there, even if you maybe continue to act as if continue to be faithful to your spouse or something like that. Maybe that's not the best example because if you believe your spouse is a bad person, that's a pretty extreme belief. But maybe you could come up with a case that's not as extreme of a belief where you disbelieve certain things about your spouse, but you can continue in your marriage. So anyway, I think it could possibly apply beyond the theistic case too. Okay, I'm going to address two outstanding questions and then wrap up. So the first is, we've talked about action-focused faith, we've talked about attitude-focused faith. Is one of these kinds of faith like more important or more fundamental? What I want to say here is not exactly. Okay, so I think there's one sense in which action-focused faith is extremely important. You know, people say things like, actions speak louder than words, you know? And if people make a claim, but they're just not willing to act on it, we often see them as like not genuine, would question like whether they even made that claim genuinely at all. Do you even really believe that? So if one has a religious commitment about like the spiritual and the fundamental nature of reality, I think I'd rather them have this like action-focused one alone rather than the attitude one alone. So again, I'm not saying that the action one's more important necessarily, but I do think, yeah, in the sense that actions speak louder than words, there's something very important about action-focused faith. On the other hand, I do think that people with attitude-focused faith, if rational, are often going to act accordingly. And so I think attitude-focused faith is often going to lead to action-focused faith. So again, in the spouse example, where you believe your spouse isn't cheating and you want your marriage to succeed, you know, assuming those things are justified and based on good evidence, then you should act accordingly. You shouldn't act on your fear, or jealousy, or paranoia. So that's enough, like a way in which I think attitude-focused faith is important, because I think for rational people, it'll lead to action-focused faith. That said, I do think action-focused faith can lead to attitude faith. So sometimes if you want to believe something, you have to, you know, people say fake it till you make it or whatever. But this again is like the trying it on atheist. And even Pascal, when people say, oh, well, Pascal, I can't like believe on God on the basis of the wager, Pascal's like, go to mass and take holy water, right? Some people think what Pascal is saying there is take these certain actions and it can lead you to believe. So I think both of these types of faith can lead to the other. And so again, I don't really think one's more important or one's more fundamental because both can lead to the other. And I don't think that, I mean, yeah, I think that especially having just attitude-focused faith is like a weird and irrational place to be. Okay. Second question, can all atheists have action-focused faith? Here, I think the answer is no. I think the most obvious case that's going to be precluded is the atheist who's 100% sure that God doesn't exist. I think that atheist really can't have faith in any sense because they think God's existence is impossible. They wouldn't hope for theism to be true. They wouldn't want to try it on. It wouldn't make sense for them to wager on it. There's also the atheist who maybe views theism as bad. And this is kind of why I thought having the conception of God as good might be important here. I don't want to say impossible, but it's less clear to me why they would have action-focused faith. Okay, so just to kind of sum up, to wrap up what we've talked about today, I've argued that atheists can have action-focused faith, but not attitude-focused faith. I think there are really apt, plausible examples of atheists with action-focused faith, but atheists don't have the belief-like attitudes required for attitude-focused faith. I think this more moderate view captures the main positive features of the two more extreme views who say there's no sense in which atheists can have faith and just like atheists can just unequivocally have faith. And I think, yeah, on my view, the relationship between atheism and faith is nuanced, but I actually think that's the right result. And I think this can really shed light on the nature of atheism, different kinds of faith, and even maybe some unique strands of religious commitment that are less common and haven't been considered before, but deserve their place at the table. All right, that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments.